Okay, so last week we finished the Hakdasha, the consecration of, or almost finished the consecration of Yechezkel to be a Navi, and we studied the story of the fact that God told him to eat the scroll, and the fact that God told him that people would not listen to him, which is very, very clear. God makes that point a number of times. Ubeit Yisrael lo yovu lishmo elecha. They will not deem appropriate to listen to you because they're very stubborn, and it doesn't matter because Beit Merihim, they are rebellious, etc. And basically, God tells him the point is, as he said at the beginning of the whole thing, is the point in chapter 2 is that they should know ki navi betocham. They'll know that you have said something. God has said that this is going to happen, and irrespective of their behavior, meaning because they are not ready to do teshuvah, and you're not pushing them to do teshuvah because your goal is in 593 BCE to basically tell them the jig is up and basically try to minimize whatever catastrophe is going to happen. Your role is not to give them, to try to get them to do tshuva in the sense that that's already, it's done. The Hurban is going to happen. And the fact is that they're not going to listen anyway. And so we got up to this point. And I mentioned last week, and I wanted to highlight again the dilemma, and again try to resolve the dilemma that unpacks itself in Perek Gimel, because after this nevuah, Hashem tells him, "You're going to go back to the Golah. You're going to go back to the people living in Bavel, living in that place where you came from on Nahar Kvar, and you're going to tell them what you just that God is leaving the temple." And we got up to this point. Vatisaeni ruach vashmacharai kol ra'ash gadol. Again, the word ruach is one of those key words in the first chapters of the book of Yechezkel. So I was taken by a ruach. Before, he talked about the ruach, the spirit that animated the chayot, the creatures that he saw in the divine retinue and the divine entourage. Now he actually experiences a real ruach, an actual ruach. V'ashmacharai kol ra'ash gadol. So it feels like the vision is over and now we're back to real life. It's a debate whether we're back to real life or not amongst the Parshanim. My general inclination is to suggest that at this point he's back to real life. Vatisaeni ruach v'ashmacharai kol ra'ash gadol baruch kavod Adonai mimkomo. I heard the sound. V'kol kanfei achayot mashikot isha lachota. V'ruach nisatani. A ruach actually carried me. Va'elech mar b'chamat ruchi. I was bitter, I was frustrated, I was upset. V'yad Adonai alai chazaka. But God's hand was on me. Again, we talked about last week how Yechezkel is very reticent. And throughout the story, the fact that God has to constantly tell him, don't be afraid. It doesn't matter if they listen to you, they don't listen to you, that there was a certain hesitancy. And here too, there's a hesitancy of Yechezkel. Is the hesitancy because he's not happy with the message that he has to deliver? Or is he unhappy because he is unhappy that the fact that they won't listen to him? Is that what he's unhappy to him? Unclear, but he's certainly not happy about doing this. Va'avo el haGolah. I came to the Golah. I came to the people, Tel Aviv, in the city of Tel Aviv. We talked about at the end last week what Tel Aviv means in Akkadian. Hayoshvim el Nahar Kvar. Va'eshev hema yoshvim sham. And I sat with them. Va'eshev sham. And I sat together with them. Shivat Yamim Mashmim Betocham. I was quiet. Again, this may be his kind of passive aggressive resistance. He didn't say anything to them. He didn't recall, he didn't say to them any of the things that God had told him, to tell them from chapter 2. He didn't say anything about the fact that, they had been rebellious up until this time, and he didn't say a word. Again, maybe because he's upset, maybe because he doesn't want, he knows, maybe he's afraid of the people, we don't know. But as I mentioned right at the very end of the class, at this point, we could have jumped perfectly from this pasuk to skipping this to here. We could have jumped Vatihi alai sham yad Adonai. Vayomer elai kum tz'el habika. Go to the bika. V'sham adaber otcha. And there I will speak with you. This would have been the continuation. He is living. He comes back. Va'eshev sham. Va'eshev hema yoshvim sham. I sat where they were sitting. Va'eshev sham shivat yamim. I stayed there for 7 days, quiet, desolate amongst them. I was not speaking. Vayhi miktzei shivat yamim, and I could have jumped exactly after 7 days. Vatehi alai sham yad Adonai. Vayomer elai kum tzei labika v'sham, and there adaber otcha. It's a perfect connection, and not only is it a perfect connection, but the language is perfect. Because what does God tell him? Va'akum va'itzel b'kavine sham kavod Adonai. God's glory was there. Kakavod shariti al nahar kvar va'epol al panai. Just as in chapter 1, at the end of chapter 1, he falls on his face. So too here. Va'tavo bi ruach va'tamideni al raglai va'daber tivermelai bo hisager b'toch beitecha. Go and close yourself up in your house. Ve'ata ben adam hinei natnu alecha avutim. People are going to, or someone is going to put upon you chains. Va'asarucha behem v'lo teitzei b'tocham. You will not go out amongst the people. Ulishoncha adbik el chikecha. And I will cleave your tongue up into your palate. V'ne'elamta milashon ilaim. Ilaim is to be silent, deaf mute. V'lo tieh lahem leish mochiach. And you will not speak, and you will not give them musar, and you will not give them reproof. Ki beit meri hema, for they are a beit meri. And if you look back, you'll see that this is a continuation. That was the term that was used before in the initial Hakdasha, ki beit meri hema. They are people of rebelliousness. 7 days later, God tells him, shifts and says, now I want you to stay in your house and you're not going to speak until I tell you to speak. Ubedabri otcha eftach et picha. When I speak to you, I'm going to open your mouth. Whoever listens to what you say will listen. And who doesn't want to listen won't listen. Ki beit meri hema, for they are. So there. This fits like a glove. This fits like a glove. Perfect from one place we skip, and in fact, from a Masoretic point of view, you'll notice we have something very strange in the middle of Pasuk Tet Zayin. If you look in the scroll of Yechezkel, you'll find a peya, parsha ptucha. That means you have empty space here, which implies that this is kind of stop. And then you have implying that this section here, from the middle of Tet Zayin until Pasuk Chaf Aleph is really an insertion that really doesn't fit. And when we read Pasuk Tet Zayin from the middle to Pasuk Chaf Aleph, it's clear that it is a separate section. It's definitely a separate section. The question is, does it make sense that it's here? What do I mean by does it make sense that it's here? Let's read it. Vayhi Devar Adonai Elai Lemor Ben Adam Tzofeh Nitaticha Lebeit Israel. I have made you a tzofeh. What's a tzofeh? A tzofeh is a watchman. A tzofim, Harat Tzofim, the Mount Scopus, where scouts and you scope out. You put someone on top of a mountain or on top of a wall to be the watchman and tell people what's going to happen before it happens. Tell people that the army is approaching. Tell people that foreigners are approaching. Whatever it is. Meaning, the watchman's goal is to raise an alarm. Meaning the watchman's goal is to talk. Ben Adam tzofen et taticha lebeit Yisrael v'shamata mipi davar. When you hear words from me, v'hizharta otam mimeni, then you will whatchamacallit, you will actually warn them. And it's just in terms of Tanakh. If you look in Tanakh, for example, in the book of Yirmiyahu, if we go to the book of Yirmiyahu, chapter 6 in Yirmiyahu, this is one of the tafkidim. This is one of the roles and terms how prophets are described in later Nevi'im. So the Navi will, for example, here, he says, Ko amar Adonai, imdu al drachim ur'u v'shalul ntivot olam, eze derech hatov v'luchuba, umitz'u gmar gol nafshchem, vayomru lo nelech. The people were rebellious and said, no, we don't want to find out what's the proper behavior. V'hakimoti aleichem tzofim, I will establish upon you watchmen, hakshivu l'kol shofar, listen to their sound, to their cry, to their warning blasts. When they talk, it's like the shofar of the watchman warning that the army, the attacking army is coming. Vayomru lo nakshiv. We won't listen to them. So the Navi is a warner. The Navi is considered the tzofeh. And so when God here tells him he's going to be tzofeh, he's going to be a tzofeh, that's very different. And at first blush, it's actually contradictory to be an ilaim, v'ne'elamta. V'lo ti'eh lahem le'ish mochiach. You won't warn them. You won't give them musar. So it's a kind of contradiction, one to the other. Is he supposed to be a tzofeh, or is he supposed to be silent? And that's why it sounds like this entire little section here is out of place. Because what is he supposed to say? Be'omri, when I, God, you should warn them with the following statement. Be'omri la rasha mot tamut. Because you are supposed to say to the Rasha, you will die because of your actions. V'lo hizharto, if you don't warn them and don't take your role seriously as a tzofeh and sharing with them that this is their fate if they don't change. V'lo dibarta lahazhir rasha midarko harisha'a l'chayoto, in order to help him live, hu rasha ba'avono yamut v'damo miyadcha avakesh. He will die because he didn't get better, but I will search I will hold you responsible. Another problem that I want to raise. Before, God said, you're going to speak and they're going to listen. They're not going to listen. What's the difference? Meaning, why now is it on Yechezkel's head to make sure that he says, and if he doesn't say, then it's on his head? Why is it on his head? God said, even if you tell them, they're not going to listen to you. So, what's going on here? Just trying to understand how this fits in, these 5, 6 psukim fit into the whole context of the early nivuot of Yechezkel. It continues. A second example. V'ata ki harta rasha. But if you do warn the rasha, v'lo shav mirisho midako rasha, hu bavano yomot v'ata nafshecha hitzalta. You have saved yourself. Ubishuv tzadik mitzidko. Another example. When the tzaddik, the person who's righteous, has a backsliding and decides not to keep the covenant anymore, ve'asa avel, he does an iniquity, v'natati michshol lefanav, and then I will put a stumbling block in his path, hu yamut, ki lo hizharto b'chatao yumat, v'lo tizacharna tzidkato asher asa. You're held responsible, and you're not going to be able to get off and say, well, but I did a lot of good things. But v'damo miyadcha avakesh, because you didn't warn him. Ki lo hizharto. Ve'ata ki hizharto tzaddik. But if you did warn him, levoti chato tzaddik v'ulo chata, and he didn't sin, chayo yichyeh, he will live. Ki nizhar. Ve'ata nafshecha hitzalta. So what exactly is this doing here in the middle? And I want to make it even more of a problem. It's not just me, it's everybody who's ever learned Sefer Yechezkel. Both traditional Meforshim and modern day scholars have raised the problem, and that is, we have this Nevuah again in chapter 33. In chapter 33, God says that the Navi is supposed to be at Sofeh. It's kind of a rerun of the Nevuah, but at greater length. When we get to chapter 33, we'll analyze each line. But here I just want to show it to you. Ben Adam daber al bnei amcha. Speak to your people. V'martlem eretz ki avielhem charev. When a land is being attacked by the sword, v'lakchu am haaretz ish echad miktzeim v'natnu otam litzofeh. They put a watchman. So he blows the shofar and he warns the people. If the people hear the warning, and they're not careful, they don't escape. So he's responsible for not trying to escape. At kol shofar shama, he heard the warning. But if the watchman sees he didn't blow the amlo nizhar, and the people were not able to be careful. He's liable. I will seek the blood of the warner, of the watchman. Ve'ata ben adam tzofeh nitaticha lebeit Yisrael v'shamata mipi davar v'izharto tamimenu. Now you are the watchman. And the exact same language that we saw here, together with a couple of other cases, are mentioned here. So what you have here is in chapter 33, which happens right before the Hurban, because at the end of chapter 33, the Bible tells us, Vayhi b'shtei esrei shana, in the 11th year after the exile of Yehoiachin, which means 586, ba'asiri b'chamisha lachodesh. So, legalutenu, in the 10th month, the 5th day of the month, of the 10th month. Ba'ilai hapalit Yerushalayim lemor hu kitah ha'ir. The city has been captured, destroyed. And at that point, V'yad Hashem hayta lai ba'erev, vayiftach et pi ad bo elai baboker, vayipatach pi v'lo ne'elamti yod. I was no longer silent. So it's very weird. How do we put together this chapter and chapter 3? And internally in chapter 3, the fact is Yechezkel, who is supposed to talk, because it's clear that to be Yechezkel is not to be silent, and yet at the same time here he's told that you're supposed to be silent. So which is it? So here, there's basically two approaches. Both of them are have a lot to recommend to themselves. And so I just want to put on the table each approach which has been developed, especially amongst a number of the modern writers, both traditional and not traditional. So the first approach is you find in Dat Mikra, but it's also been adopted by many scholars of the book of Yechezkel in the Jewish and non-Jewish world, which is to ask a fundamental question, which is whenever you have two chapters which are repetitive like that. Okay, let's just stop the share. Let's see everybody's face for a little bit. It's good to see people's faces. So whenever you have two chapters which seem very repetitive, the question you always have to ask is one playing off the other? Meaning, which one is the original and which one is the citation? Because if you have two chapters that have basically the same language and basically the same message, usually what you can suggest is that one is a version of the other. For some reason, it's being repeated, and one was the original and one is the repetition. So which one is the original and which one is the repetition? And why would be repeated is always the question. Why would it be here and why would it be repeated? So the Dat Mikra, and as I said, many other scholars will argue the following. They'll argue, and this makes sense in general in literature, you usually go by the longer version. The longer version is usually the original one. People like to shorten things rather than when they're citing something. So the longer version is probably the original one. Okay, but then we have to go, if you accept that, then what you can then go and suggest is that the situation is depending on the historical time that we're talking about. What do I mean by that? Yechezkel, remember, begins in 593, 5 years after the exile of Yehoiachin, 6 years before the Hurban, before the destruction of the temple. It's a critical moment in Jewish history, and God says to him, it's been decided that the Galut that started in 598 will continue. The Hurban that started in 598, where they took the riches of the treasure of the Beit HaMikdash, will now come to its conclusion in 586. Basically, that's the message of the book of Yechezkel, the first half of the book of Yechezkel, till chapter 24. And so basically, the suggestion is that what we call the Tkufat HaElem, the period of silence, really is the first 24 chapters of the book of Yechezkel, conceptually. This was the time when Yechezkel was basically supposed to be silent. Why was he supposed to be silent? Because there's not much to say. And I'll get to it in a few minutes. I'll get to talk about what does it mean to be silent. Does it mean that he never was going to utter a word to anybody? No, that can't be, because we actually have him talking to people during the course of these 6 years between now and chapter 33. But It means that fundamentally the Hurban is going to happen. There is nothing to warn the people about anymore because it's a done deal. All he can do is simply share whatever he's going to share. But it is the tkufa ta'elem. It's the tkufa of, of silence. And conceptually, as I showed you, in the middle of chapter 3, now we'll go back. In the middle of chapter 3, basically, from here, after he's brought back to the Golah, after he was told that you're going to speak these things, and maybe they'll listen, maybe they won't listen. They probably won't listen, kibet Merihim, because they are rebellious. At this point, God says, after you do that, we skip from here, God says, you're basically going to be silent for the next few years. You're basically not going to really do a lot. You're not going to be an ish mochiach. You're not going to actually be giving them warning. You're not at Sofeh because basically it's a done deal. And if we look, for example, in chapter 24, which is the end of the first section of the book of Yechezkel, before he gives the nevuot, the prophecies to the Amim. So he says, he promises, he says, Bayom Hahu, on the day when God says, I'm going to take away the Beit HaMikdash. V'ata ben Adam, halo b'yom kachti mehem et ma'uzam misos tifartam. The day that I take away from them their fortress and that which they have pleasure in. Machmad enem. Bayom hahu yavo apalit elecha. On that day, the refugee will come and tell you. Bayom hahu yipatach picha et apalit. The refugee will open your mouth. Utidaber velo te'alem od. Vayita lahem lemofet. You will be for them a mofet. You will be for them a shining star, if you want to say. V'yadu kani Adonai. On that day, you become it Sofeh. On that day, you become it Sofeh. And that's exactly what happened in chapter 33. In chapter 33, God says to him, you're going to be at Sofeh. You're going to be at Sofeh. You're going to tell them about the things that are coming up. Because in the aftermath of the Hurban, there are challenges that are going to happen. There are decisions that have to be made. There are decisions about how to save yourself in the future or not. And right after that, the Palit came and he said, Vayiftach et pi ad bo elai baboker. Vayipatach pi velo ne'elamti od. I was no longer an elem. I was no longer silent. This is the continuation of chapter 3, 6 years after this. He was going to be at Sofeh, but only in 6 years. This little section here, claims Dat Mikra, is put in by the final editors of the book of Yechezkel. Meaning, Yechezkel did not get this nevuah here at this time in 593. He was told to become at Sofeh in 586 as the Hurban is approaching. He's told you are now going to play a different role. You're going to warn them, and you're going to teach them, and you're going to help them, and you're going to do all kinds of things. And you're going to stop being, quote unquote, silent. That was in 587, 586. The final editors of the book decided at the beginning of the book that they wanted to put both of the tafkidim, both of the roles that Yechezkel was going to play in his history and in the book already in the front. So this is kind of like a little hint. This is a mikutzar version of what he eventually is going to become. That he will be at Sofeh. And this is a kind of summary version of chapter 33 that the final editors thought it was important to put in, and then so he's going to be at Sofeh at some point, and right now he's going to be an Elaim. He's going to be much more silent, much more whatchamacallit, much more silent and not involved in the day-to-day affairs of the people. Just to quote you from one of the modern books that discusses this. He says as follows. Nivuat Hatzofeh. This is from a book by Ariel Kopilovich. It's a very good book on the book of Yechezkel. Nivuat Hatzofeh noada milechatchila l'shamesh pticha l'chativat nivuot hatkuma. The nivuah about the tzofeh was the introduction to the nivuot of revival, which start in chapter 34, 35, 36, 37, etc. As we mentioned, V'hatzavat otek mikutzar mimena, and the placing of a copy, a shortened version of that nevuah, which is the real nevuah, is chapter 33, and putting a short version of it here, gam b'samuch l'chazon hatalat hashlichut, right next to the beginning of the book when he is given his mission, he totzaat avodato shel ha'orech. It is the result of the work of the final editor, the editor. Efshar she'orech zeh sha'af. It could be that this final editor wanted liyaches la navi, to, so to speak, to identify the Navi at tafkirat sofeh kvar mitchilat darko. He wanted it to be clear that from the very beginning, the outset, God had intended the Navi to play a dual role, both to be at Sofeh later on, as well as to be the Elaim right now. Okay? And he thought that this is part of the plan of how they wanted the book to be read. That is the Gisha of Dat Mikra. It's also cited by Professor Professor Tova Ganzel in her book on Yechezkel, and it's also cited by Rabbi Bazak in his book as one of the efshariot, one of the possibilities. The second possibility is to suggest, and again, I think it fits in very nicely with the language, that it's clear that the original shlichut is all about that they won't listen, and if they won't listen, then you're basically going to be an elaim. It also could be that part of the ilmut is a punishment, because when he came back, he resisted going and even doing that first thing. Va'ishev sham shivat yamim mashmim betocham. I was just desolate and I didn't do anything. So maybe God kind of gives him a sort of little punishment. Okay, you don't want to do anything, so I'm going to make you very, very silent. I'm not going to give you almost any role except the role that I tell you to do exactly. Okay, so that's also could be at. The second approach is, and it could be that you can combine the two approaches as well, is that the Nivuat HaTzofeh, and that maybe we're being too fancy, and maybe there was a tzofeh role even from 593 to 586, in the sense that there's a difference between the national and the personal. Meaning the Navi, in his national role, is supposed to be Elaim. He's supposed to give very few nevuot. He's supposed to be silent. V'ne'elamta. V'lo tia lahem le'ish mochiach ki beit Merihem, which sounds like it's addressing the house. They're a house of rebellion. It's addressing the national dimension. The people as a whole are not interested in doing tshuva, And as a whole, their fate has been decided, which is that the Hurban is going to happen. Jerusalem will be destroyed. The people as a whole will be exiled. That is a fact. And that is part of your reality. And therefore, there's not much that you can do to change that. On the other hand, there's also the individuals, meaning what happens to an individual who is sinning right now? What happens to someone who's in trouble right now? Does he have the possibility of saving himself, or at least minimizing the effects of the Hurban on himself because of his actions? Because he's not doing the right thing in terms of how he's treating the poor, etc. Or he's too involved in his avodah zarah, whatever it is that he's doing. And so it could be that these psukim, the tzofeh psukim, are given right now, but they're given for the role of the individual. Notice it talks about the Rasha and the Tzaddik and Darko, etc., etc., as opposed to the Am, as opposed to the people in general. And on the one hand, on the personal level, Yechezkel can have an impact on individuals and that they can improve themselves or ensure that they will live and survive the cataclysm, as opposed to the nation where he's going to be ne'elam, he's going to be much more quiet. Okay. I want to also now, for a second, let me just see if there's any comments, any questions. Okay, the Seder. I want to now take just a few moments because the Parshanim on Yechezkel also, they wanted to understand, what does it mean that he's going to be an elem, that he's going to actually be silent? I mean, there's another 20 chapters where he talks or things happen. What do you mean he's going to be silent? Does it really mean he's going to be silent? How silent can you be? So there's basically 5 approaches that you find in the classical and modern readings. One approach is he's not really going to be silent, like forever. It just means that symbolically, for a week, a year, a day, I don't know, whatever it is, that he was supposed to be silent. So he went through the kind of motions. He went like on a Tanis Dibur for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, which was symbolic of the fact that there was nothing really to say to the people. Lamaisa, he was going to speak occasionally, but symbolically, he did this as a symbolic act for a couple of days, a couple of weeks. Maybe also, as I said, as part of the punishment for not wanting to go. So God says, okay, I'm going to use you as a symbol of, and you can think about it, it's just like Klal Yisrael. Just like Klal Yisrael doesn't want to hear, so too he is not able to speak. Maybe. The second approach, which is very common, is to say, yes, he's going to be silent unless God wants him to talk. So basically, kind of, speak when you're spoken to, kind of, that he's only given permission to speak on occasion. So it doesn't mean he's silent. It just means that he doesn't have the right to go around giving his own drushes. Nevi'im are constantly giving drushes. Sometimes drushes that they got from God directly, or based upon things that they decide to take upon themselves, that they're going to go and make a speech. You are only allowed to say exactly what I tell you to say. The third approach is to suggest that maybe he would not be a public speaker, but in his house he would speak. Because we are going to see, for example, just to give you an example, if you look in chapter 8 of the book of Yechezkel, I'll get up here. If you look at chapter 8, so Yechezkel says, Vayhi b'shana hashishit, in the 6th year, Bashishi, b'chamisha lachodesh, ani yoshev beveiti, v'ziknei Yehuda yoshrim lefanai, Vatipol alai sham yad Adonai vareh, etc., etc. So there are people who are hanging around in his house. Or in chapter 14. In chapter 14, Vayavo Elai Anashim Iznei Vayeshvu Lefanai. So there are people who are coming to his house to schmooze with him. So it may be, yes, he's not allowed to go out and be a kind of public Navi and go and gather people at Madison Square Garden and have a revival. But people can come to him and talk to him. The yeah, the another approach is to say that yes, in addition to speaking to the people who came to speak to him in his house, he also might have been able to communicate through letters. We know in the book of Yirmiyahu, for example, sometimes Yirmiyahu communicates through writing. And so maybe Yechezkel was not supposed to be a speaker, but he would be able to communicate further through writing. And that would be how he would, then move on and communicate to the people. So this is a kind of the issues that are discussed. I want to set up. We don't have a lot of time, but I want to set up, and I can't really start. But I want to set up the next chapter. So again, remember for those who came late, next week there's no class because it is Thanksgiving. So and I have a wedding to go to with my wife. But let's just set up. We now move. We've completed the mission. So we had chapter 1 was the vision of God and his retinue that Yechezkel saw, which is a central theme in this book and probably represents the idea of God's mobility and the fact that God would go from place to place and would not remain in the temple. If someone could mute, there's stuff coming through on somebody's thing. Number Perek Bet, we had the fact that Perek Bet and Gimel, we had the Hakdasha, the actual consecration of Yechezkel to be a Navi, to be a prophet, and what exactly was his tafkid, what exactly was his role? Was his role to be a mochiach, to be a... I'm sorry, somebody is...
name is Cohen.
Mr. Cohen?
Yeah. Okay. He's talking on the phone or something.
Yes, if Mr. Cohen, if you could stop, if you're on the phone, please mute yourself from the share.
He's muted now.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Back. Okay, so chapter 2 and 3 were the Hakdasha, the dedication, consecration, mission of the prophet. Chapter 4 and 5, which are just going to, so to speak, set the groundwork for. Chapter 4 and 5 are what we would call ma'asim simliim, are the symbolic acts. Yechezkel is called upon to do more symbolic acts than any other prophet in the entire Tanakh. Parenthetically, it might be, given the fact that he wasn't supposed to give so many speeches, maybe Dafka, someone who's not supposed to give so many speeches and is supposed to be more silent than other prophets. So the audio-visual element had to play a greater role in terms of how he was going to communicate his message and God's message to the people. So we're going to see in chapter 4 that there's a series of 5 ma'asim simliim. There's a series of 5 symbolic acts that he's going to do, which all start with this, V'ata ben Adam, and we're going to see that that's a recurring phrase, V'ata ben Adam, V'ata ben Adam, etc., etc. We're going to see a whole series. So it starts with something that doesn't require a lot of unpacking. So we'll just do this first one because that is the foundation of all the other ones. V'ata ben Adam kach lecha levena. Levena is, of course, is a brick. And of course, it's very evocative because, of course, Bavel is the place where they built bricks originally. If you remember the Bavel story in Breshit, in the book of Genesis, that's the origin of building bricks. So take a brick V'natata uta lefanecha v'chakota le'ir at Yerushalayim. You should inscribe it on it a city that looks like Jerusalem. Does it mean that he wrote the words Jerusalem on it, or a city? They've actually discovered in a number of archaeological digs in Mesopotamia where people would make a picture of the city that they were in on a brick. It was like a commemorative brick. V'natata aleha matzor. Symbolically, you are going to make a siege. How are you going? You're going to do a little model, a little Lego set. Ubanita alea daik. You're going to build these daik. Daik here probably means, according to most scholars, something along the lines of some sort of tower that were towers that surrounded the wall of the city that you were attacking so that you could get a glimpse in and see what preparations they were doing in the city. V'shafachta le'asolela. If you've ever been to Masada, you know that they, around the fortress, when you want to make a siege, you put like earth ramps. You fill in the earth, so that's a solela. V'shafachta, you will pour the dirt so that you can have ramps to be able to bring up your weapons over the wall or over the fortress. V'natata le'amachanot, you will put upon it little encampments around so that people can't flee. V'sim aleha karim saviv, and you will put around it these weapons. Ve'ata kach lecha machvat barzel. So after you've done this little symbolism of a siege, ve'ata kach lecha machvat barzel. Take a machva, literally means to a little like frying pan, but it's a piece of metal like a blech. V'natata tokir barzel beincha ubein ha'ir, and it's a separation between you and the city. Does that mean that Yechezkel is symbolically now the enemy coming to attack, or is it that that there's a distance between God and the city? If you remember Chazal, the rabbis talk about how after the Hurban, there's a kir barzel. They get that language from here, that there's like a wall, like on Tisha B'Av, God doesn't hear our prayers. There's like a wall separating us between God. V'achinota et panecha eleh, you shall direct your face towards it. V'haita b'matzor, v'tzarta aleha, and you will act as if you're sieging this city. Oti lebeit Israel. It is a sign for the Jewish people. So Im Yirtzeh Hashem, in 2 weeks, we will, building on this, we're going to see the actual symbolic acts that are harder to understand and what they mean, which we're going to have to unpack. But it all revolves around the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem and what those various symbolic acts are going to mean. Again, I want to wish everybody a good Shabbat, a good week. Everyone should have a good Thanksgiving if you commemorate Thanksgiving, and for those in Canada who've already done Thanksgiving, or again, are there any Canadians here?
Yes, we've had Thanksgiving already. Yeah.
You had Thanksgiving. Okay,
Well, I have Thanksgiving every day.
Okay, beautiful, very, very beautiful. Do they eat turkey in Canada?
Yeah, sure.
Of course.
Okay.
Why
Of
not?
course.
Do you think a turkey is an indigenous American bird?
No, I'm just saying, do they eat it on Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is it part of the mitzvah of Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, so Shabbat Shalom to everyone, and see you next week. Okay. I'll see you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Yeah. Enjoy the wedding.
Thank you.
Like gesehen. Good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Thank you.
Okay.